Punjab represented a military state. In fact, the word Punjab as a semi-military state was used while there was a discussion about the interwar years and especially during and after the Second World War. Elections had been introduced in British India. The source of legitimacy was increasingly identified with mass mandate, which was at that time limited, but it expanded as we moved towards independence. People who used to fight elections under the British, they continued to dominate the constituencies spread all over the country through their patronage structures. For example, they dominated the rural areas, which represented at that time 85% of the country, and projected this idea that the political leadership was corrupt, it was dynastic, it was not representative of the masses at large, it was exploitative of those very people whom they represented in the parliament. Now, in the framework of Pakistan, military bureaucratic establishment, an expression which was popularized by Hamza Alawi, that establishment was recruited from the middle class in majority of the cases. When you talk about army, you talk about the officer cadre, but even otherwise, Punjab represented a military state. In fact, the word Punjab as a semi-military state was used while there was a discussion about the interwar years and especially during and after the Second World War. Now that is how this establishment, which controlled British India for more than 100 years, that was very much at the heart of the new power structure. And while the migrant elite did not have a constituency in those areas which now became Pakistan, therefore there was a kind of coordination and support for each other between the two wings of the state apparatus, that is, the civil and military apparatuses. Now, this continued to be in charge of the new state. On the other hand, from 1919 onwards, elections had been introduced in British India. The source of legitimacy was increasingly identified with mass mandate, which was at that time limited, but it expanded as we moved towards independence. And after independence, of course, the adult franchise was the norm in both India and Pakistan. Now that meant that those people who used to fight elections under the British, they continued to dominate the constituencies spread all over the country through their patronage structures. For example, they dominated the rural areas, which represented at that time 85% of the country. So they were there, and there was no love lost between the two kinds of classes. One, the middle class, which operated either through the state apparatuses of army and bureaucracy, and also as the professional elite, doctors, engineers, professors, journalists, others. So this middle class had its own vision, which was based on merit. They have been consistently critical of the political class in terms of merit. For example, they said and projected this idea that the political leadership was corrupt, it was dynastic, it was not representative of the masses at large, it was exploitative of those very people whom they represented in the parliament and so on. And that meant that the political initiative, which was firmly in the hands of those who were outside the parliament, for example, belonging to the civil military establishment, they continued to be in the seat of power even when there were elected assemblies out there. For example, they controlled policy, they projected and shaped ideology, and they tended to follow those issues in public debate which served the purpose of those who were dominant in the power structure. That's how there is this antinomy, there is this dichotomy in the elite. There is the middle class and there is the political class. The political class has the advantage of representing the society and therefore being able to fight elections through their control over their constituencies, the establishment control policy, and of course it controlled the distribution of state resources. That meant the first major conflict in Pakistan emerged very early in Pakistan's history in ethnic terms. Those who belong to the two dominant ethnic communities and those who belong to the other four communities, ethnic and linguistic communities, which struggled to be represented in the state. The establishment was very much dominated by the two communities that we have talked about, the Muhajirs and increasingly Punjabis, because of their access to education, which was required as a prerequisite to be part of the establishment, and that's why there was a constant focus on meritocracy. The middle class felt that democracy was the negation of meritocracy. They accused the politicians of being illiterate, uneducated, not knowing what the world is all about, driven by their identity-based pursuits, for example, by way of language, Bengali, Sindhi, or by way of ethnic commitments, Pakhtun and Baloch, and of course Bengali and Sindhi and others. And that means that we have in front of us not only this mega conflict, but also the conflict between their cultural expressions. That's how I call them as representatives of high culture and low culture. High culture, of course, was represented by the ruling ethnic communities. Here, Urdu was the central factor by way of becoming a way of communication which was spread all around, and it was considered to be a legitimate factor in the making of Pakistan itself. So, there was this merit-based, institution-based and ideologically oriented state apparatus which upheld the cause of Islam and nationalism. On the other hand, as opposed to this so-called state elite, there was the political elite, which comprised politicians, obviously, along with their idea of public interest, as opposed to the national interest, which is the favorite expression of the state elite. Now, all that meant what? Politicians represented locality and their respective ethnic communities. That meant diversity. On the other hand, the state elite, the establishment, favored unity. From day one, unity has been pressed very much as the basis of the new national existence, let's say. So that was a major conflict. What kind of constitution, what kind of federation there would be, where there would be division of powers between the federating units of the country. On the other hand, there was this elite which focused on uniting the nation. That means focusing on those aspects which would diminish the relevance of the diversity. For example, at the level of West Pakistan, there was in fact a process of defederalization in the form of one unit. 4 federating units of Punjab, Sindh, KP and Balochistan were all put together into one mega province in pursuit of parity with East Pakistan. One unit provided the basis for the 2 constitutions, 1956 and 1962. There were movements in the 3 smaller provinces of West Pakistan against what they called the steamroller of one unit, because this time they had lost their capital cities, Peshawar, Quetta and Karachi, and it was a step towards Punjabization of the state. So, in this way, the unity factor as an ideology and concentration of power, particularly in terms of policy making in the hands of the establishment, that meant that there emerged, after the 4 episodes of military rule, a kind of democracy which I have termed in the book as establishmentarian democracy. This means that those who got elected into the national and provincial assemblies, they were the ones who were there largely in the pleasure of the establishment. And that meant that the media was controlled so as to shape the national discourse in a certain way. And if we take out 17 years of direct military rule by these military rulers and 6 years of a modicum of civilian supremacy over armed forces, such as those of Bhutto from 1971 to 77, that means today, that is 2024, out of 77 years of post-independence history of Pakistan, 54 years were those represented by the establishmentarian democracy, which meant before Ayub Khan, 11 years, there were elections, there were elected institutions such as the Constituent Assembly, National Assembly, provincial assemblies, and there was the reality of the all-powerful bureaucratic establishment at that time, which then continued to move on to become the military bureaucratic establishment, and lately sometimes it is called militablishment. That means now military is the dominant part of this establishment.